Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to today's webinar, Perfecting the Software Lifecycle. With such a audacious title as Perfecting and something as wide a scope as Lifecycle, I wanted to ask one of my analyst buddies, Donnie from 451 Research, along to give us some context setting and framing, and also some reporting about what's going on out there in the industry with people who are working on developing and running and delivering their own software. And really pulling in some of I guess you could call them the three major trends that seem to be pushing a lot of how people are doing software well. Looking at microservices, containers, and DevOps, sort of the architecture, process, and infrastructure around how a lot of this software is run, and just kind of peek a little bit at the business motivation as well. And then before I hand it off to him to round it off, I'll also be, at the end, going over how we at Pivotal are helping our customers perfect the software lifecycle, as it were. And we'll have a little bit of discussion at the end, going over some frequent topics, sort of off the slides, if you will, that both of us encounter. And with that, I'll hand it over to Donnie.
All right. Thank you, Michael. Appreciate that. So I work at 451 Research, and we spend a lot of time digging into leading edge technology trends, thinking about how our enterprises beginning to change the way they think about technology, being able to make bets on the future instead of trying to make safe choices. And we see the way people in IT shops across the world think about technology continuing to evolve in this direction over time. On this slide, I'm showing you some data of some pretty large-scale surveys we do, showing the way that IT leaders think about their business goals is continuing to move away from penny pinching, away from meeting the budget no matter what, and thinking about that as the way that they get their next promotion, the way that they can help the company, to a new approach centered much more around agility and risk. We hear a lot about high-level buzzwords like digital transformation. We hear a lot about disruptors and software is eating the world, and companies like Airbnb, Uber, Netflix, Tesla, Zenefits, all disrupting industries across the board, whether it's taxis or insurance companies. And every one of those is thinking less and less about, how do we compete with the other conservative banks that have been around for 100 years, and more about how do we compete with the disruption that's happening out there. And so they're changing the way they think about technology to do this. And that drives a lot of these shifts about how can they become more agile, how can they move at a much faster speed, and how can they do so without breaking things all the time. A few years back, the Facebook motto was move fast and break things. And they recently changed it to one that's much more boring but much more valuable to the business, which is move fast with stable infrastructure. The question is, how can you compete in this new software-defined world without breaking everything all the time, without creating a bad customer experience? And we see companies across the board trying to move faster. I'm showing you a commissioned research study we did recently asking DevOps and leading audience, what kinds of release speeds are they getting today? And typically it hovers around monthly. If you look at the broader enterprise, it moves even closer to quarterly releases. And yet 2/3 of companies tell us that they're getting demands from their business to move faster across the board. Speed is the new imperative, but the question is how can they get that speed without breaking their infrastructure, without creating a poor customer experience all the time. And one of the key changes in mindset as far as technology that's enabling this transition is this idea of pets versus cattle, where you used to think about individual servers or VMs as pets. They would be artisanally created. They would be carefully raised. If they got sick, you'd take them to the vet. I mean, we're thinking about them much more like livestock now, whether that's cattle or sheep or goats or whatever else, where you treat them as fungible resources, right? It's a big herd. It's a fleet of servers, a fleet of VMs now. They don't get individual names, whether they're Star Trek or NASCAR or otherwise. Instead, you treat them as mail server 1 through 20, web server 1 through 10, load balancer 1 through 3, and so on. And if one of them gets a problem, you just take it out back and throw it away. You don't try and repair it anymore. It's this idea of moving toward immutable infrastructure, toward code-defined infrastructure, so that it's scalable, so that you can get consistent environments and reduce the level of risk while being able to move quickly. Now, like I said, this is an early approach. Companies are beginning to innovate in this direction to think more and more about agility and risk versus penny pinching, but it's still in the early days yet. We did a recent study asking people about what were their top use cases for cloud platforms, and we see a wide variety of different approaches, from testing new technologies to moving legacy workloads to the cloud, to the focus of this talk, which is creating this new style of applications, these cloud-native applications. So there's a wide variety of use cases, and we see as cloud continues to grow, we see more than 90% of companies using cloud today in one form or another, and more of them are continuing to build new applications, refactor existing ones toward this cloud-native approach. And I expect that's just about to take off. Now the question is, how do you get there? And it's a combination of many different approaches. One of the key process and tool-centric approaches for getting there is something we call DevOps. You may be familiar with this already, so I'm just going to cover it at a relatively high level. And I think the best way to think about DevOps is taking Agile software development and moving it from something that's just about the development team, or even just about the development operations teams, which is a traditional view of DevOps, if you will, to something that's really about doing a better job as a business, becoming a software-defined business, and extending it all the way forward, not just forward to operations, but forward to your customers, and then taking it all the way back to your business, and being able to do that iteration between your business and your customers more quickly, so that you're not just doing a better job of building the wrong thing, which is what Agile gets you, but you're able to get consistent releases out the door, be more Agile, but at the same time, be able to create the right product. And I think that's a good way to consider how DevOps is changing going forward. It's much more business-centric. We see a lot of higher-level executives very interested in these DevOps transformations, in how do they enable their companies to move faster and to do so more stably. Now, if we go one level deeper, the way I think about DevOps really comes down to three key pillars. The first one is culture, which is really about how do you enable collaboration, how do you eliminate human barriers in the process of building and releasing software so you can move more quickly. The second one is about automation, automation both of the application delivery pipeline and also of the underlying server and VM infrastructure. And finally, measurement. And this is measurement not just of the servers, but also of the people and of the life cycle. Because as you're making these transitions toward becoming more Agile, it's really important to measure your progress at doing so, because otherwise you're just throwing resources at something that's not getting you anywhere. And so you have to make sure you're measuring things like, what is the iteration speed between my business and my customer, and how am I improving that over time? How am I decreasing the time it takes to get through one of those iteration loops? And most importantly, with especially the automation and measurement components, how am I doing it in a cloud-native way? How am I thinking about things as fleets, as clusters, rather than as individual servers or individual VMs? Both from the automation perspective, as I said, but also from the measurement perspective, right? If you think about the kinds of monitoring you want to have, you don't want to get an email alert. You don't want to get some kind of flashing screen every time a server disappears if it doesn't affect the service quality you're delivering to your customers. And so it comes down to taking this new approach that's really about delivering a better service quality and doing so faster, rather than worrying about alert fatigue because your web server crashed, but nothing really got affected. And so if we hone in on the software lifecycle component of this, here's a graphic I really like showing you the gradual transition of moving from Agile development alone to a more and more DevOps-centric approach. We see companies adding continuous integration, right, getting a better testing environment, bringing in source code into a shared branch on a daily basis, if not more often, making sure the integration tests work, making sure the build works so nobody can break the build on master even though you're sharing all the code there. And then if we see companies moving on to continuous delivery. And the idea there is really not shipping code with every commit, but creating code that's ready to release with every commit. And I think this is a really important distinction in that there's a lot of cases in which you might not want to release code on an hourly basis to your customers, but you might want to ensure the process itself works so that you won't have a broken release engineering pipeline, but not know it because you're only doing quarterly releases. And finally, going one step beyond that to a true DevOps-centric approach of iterating from the business to the customer more quickly. And you might think about this in the context of continuous deployment, taking every commit and trying to push it out to customers, but you might not. And deployment is really the second piece of this modern take on software lifecycle. And we're seeing the way people think about deployments dramatically change in this more cloud-native scale-out world, where instead of having to deploy to a running server, instead people are thinking about red, black, or blue-green deployments, which is the idea that you'll deploy to a cluster that's not getting traffic right now, and then flip the switch over to it when it's ready. Or this idea of canary deployments, right, where you'll gradually roll out deployments to a small subset of users. And then if that becomes a problem, it's like the canary in the coal mine, right? The canary dies, you stop rolling out that deployment, you either roll back or you realize there's a problem, fix it, and roll forward. And this is really changing the way that people think about risk in the context of the software lifecycle, because even if something is broken, the question is not what is the risk, but how can you minimize the impact of that risk. Now, as we move more and more toward cloud native, we see a lot of new types of infrastructure emerge to support this cattle-style mindset. And one of them that supports agility from an infrastructure layer is this idea of containers, right? Taking the old school approach of VMs and dropping that down a level to enable faster startup time and also lower overhead. So it's driving efficiency, it's driving from an infrastructure level. There's a whole other group of tools that'll drive this from a development and framework level. Containers will give you some of this at the infrastructure layer. And compared to VMs, they're relatively similar, but there are some differences in terms of how much are you virtualizing, which gives you a lower overhead, which lets you do things faster and do things better. And we see people working with containers in a lot of different ways. You've got your traditional approach of the pets, if you will. And you can see this in some data from New Relic on the kinds of container runtimes they see out there in the wild. They see a peak around, let's say, the traditional pet style, which is minutes to hours to longer. They see more peaks around cattle style. And so you're talking, let's say, less than an hour, right? You launch a VM, it's up for a while. You launch a container, it's up for a while. It does its work, and then you spin it down. And then there's a new style that's starting to emerge as well, which is seconds to minutes. And this is really taking that cattle approach and bringing it to the next level, which is how can you create isolation around a single process to handle a single inbound customer request. And so containers are really changing the way we think about running technology because they enable a new style of work. And we've heard a lot about containers over the last couple of years. They're really popular with developers. We see a lot about those at developer conferences we attend, but they're not just toys. We've got some increasing data on enterprise adoption of containers that I wanted to share with you. And over the past year, we've seen container adoption in the enterprise grow very quickly, from roughly 6% of IT decision makers saying they've got containers in prod somewhere, more than doubling to about 14% now. And that's if you look at the initial and broad implementation of production containers, you can see that on this graph. So it's increasing very quickly, still a small number overall, and we consistently see around 15% of enterprises have containers in production today. And now if you look at the kinds of companies that are testing containers, it's a different story. You're up around a third or more of companies that have some kind of containerized applications in production. And so we're seeing enterprise traction grow for this idea very quickly because people are very interested in how can they get agility and how can they do so in an environmentally consistent way so that they can take the same containers they're using in development, put them in a testing and staging environment, and finally pushing them out to production to create that environmental consistency all the way through, right, to create that automated delivery pipeline all the way through. And finally, as more and more of these companies are trying to move toward increasing agility without breaking their infrastructure, we've seen them begin to move toward this idea of microservices, taking a lot of these monolithic software architectures and starting to break those down, whether it's refactoring or whether it's new greenfield apps, moving toward a new approach. And that new approach is one of loosely coupled services, of taking the traditional monolith and instead of having an unknown number of interactions among all the different components within that monolith, if you separate those, create loosely coupled services connected through well-defined APIs, suddenly you have a much better grasp of the kinds of interactions, the kinds of dependencies, and the kinds of risks associated with any change. And in addition, when you have an API-defined contract between all these different services, you're able to innovate within the context of each service without worrying too much about breaking another one because of some kind of unknown interaction or unknown dependency. You can move as fast as you want. You can deploy independently within each one of these services. And up on the slide, I'm showing you a quote from a guy named Steve Yegge. And Steve Yegge worked at Amazon, and then he moved on to Google and wrote a memo about Amazon's approach to architecture that he accidentally published to the entire world. And Steve said that Amazon around the 2002-2003 timeframe had moved toward an entirely service-oriented architecture. And according to him, Jeff Bezos said, everybody has to transfer all data within the company by APIs or they're fired, which is a pretty clear example of how important he thought it was. The consequence definitely drove a lot of this shift. And over time, we've seen Amazon become one of the fastest companies in the world at increasing new products as they continue to scale. Most companies slow down as they scale, but this service-oriented microservices style approach has enabled small groups to independently innovate because they're connected by APIs, because they're not blocked by other groups' ability to say no, ability to not share data, ability to not provide approvals. Now, I wanted to talk through a few real-world examples of companies that have moved toward microservices and the kinds of problems they encountered at first and the kinds of benefits they saw out of it. So the first one is Halo, which is sort of like Uber, but for black cabs in London. And they were sitting on a monolithic architecture. Some of the problems they encountered were that it was really hard to add new features because the architecture wasn't well understood by most developers and because the potential for breaking things was extremely high. They had slow provisioning times. Because of this monolith, there were a lot of risks every time you pushed out a new set of changes. And finally, the monolith created a single point of failure. And they decided to move toward microservices architecture over time. What I'm showing you on this chart is you can see it provided financial benefits too. There's a vertical line near the middle that looks at the point where they shifted over to microservices. And what they saw was their number of total jobs completed was able to increase over time. So they increased their efficiency from a computational perspective, but also their cost per job that they paid to the public cloud provider decreased at the same time. So they got more technically efficient and also more financially efficient by moving to an architecture that could more effectively use the same set of resources. Now, Halo started out with a pretty classic enterprise stack, PHP, Java, MySQL, nothing surprising here. And then what they moved toward was something that looks a little bit more cloud native. Right? They moved toward a set of clusters across a number of different regions. The particular technologies in use aren't particularly important. Java, Go, those kinds of enterprise languages coupled with new languages, and took a very distributed system style approach toward it. But if you think about what that architecture looks like at scale, once you built many of those, it's incredibly complicated. And the graph of all the different microservices and the different ways they interact is pretty hard to get a good grasp on, even when you look at it visually. And I think this is a really important point with this microservices idea, is that it gives you a lot of independent ability to innovate, of ability to lower risk by deploying separately, but it's also very complex. And so you have to realize when you're going into it that you're going to have to deal with increased complexity and realize that there are a lot of business-centric benefits, but it's going to require you to have a good set of tooling to support that and build up some expertise to deal with it. And this kind of architecture isn't anything surprising in this new microservices world. Complexity is really the new normal, whether you look at Halo or Netflix or Twitter or Guild Group. Across the board, you see the same kinds of patterns emerging, right? Large numbers of services, lots of interconnectivity, lots of complexity. And one of the nice things is that we're finally getting to a point where you don't have to build all these tools yourself. There's a lot of frameworks and platforms that are beginning to emerge to take away a lot of the things that aren't core differentiators so that you can focus on what matters to your business instead of focusing on building out infrastructure. Now, here's a second example I wanted to show you from a real estate company in Australia. And they were looking at a data integration project, data synchronization, across a variety of different data sources and decided to take a microservices approach to it. They found a lot of things that worked really well about microservices, the automation, the API-driven approach, the resilience. But one of the challenges they found at the time, and this was a couple years back, was there were a lot of missing tools. They had to write some of their own open source libraries for testing. They had some issues with inheritance and code sharing, but things have begun to change. The important point I want to share from this example is microservices is really a long-term strategy. If you look at the number of services as they grow over time, you can see how long it takes to get to something that spans a broad number of applications and services. You can get one app built relatively quickly, but taking the whole IT architecture and moving toward this is a long-term investment. But it's worth emphasizing that it's a strategic investment in the future of the company, because this comes back to how can you get that agility and how can you lower the risk of doing so, so that you can compete with all these companies and try and move fast even at scale. And I think microservices are one of the key approaches of how you can get there. The final example I want to talk about is a Chinese travel site called Seatrip. It's much like Kayak if you're familiar with them. And they took a very rational approach to moving toward microservices, which was, they said, let's take a look at our existing organizational structure and build microservices to suit that, so we don't have to try and do a corporate reorg at the same time we're doing a software re-architecture. And so they broke down a monolith into strategic business unit-based microservices. So they took the monolith, broke it down. You can see on this diagram the kind of way they broke it down. It looks similar to the Halo example with technical differences, as you might imagine. Saw unsurprisingly increased complexity, but they also saw a lot of the business-driven benefits in terms of agility. And this last slide I want to show you from Seatrip is something that's very indicative of what we see at microservices implementations across the board, which is people tend to come up with a lot of common requirements. There's a lot of design patterns that are starting to emerge around this. And we're beginning to see increasing numbers of frameworks and platforms grow to support these common design patterns. And whether it's more development style tooling like service discovery, RESTful APIs, API management, or whether it's more operationally focused like metrics, logging, rate limiting, we're seeing a lot of these start to emerge and form into cohesive frameworks and platforms so that people can start to build out microservices. So I want to wrap up in conclusion and bring you some of the key points here in terms of moving toward this cloud-native world to approach increased agility and lower risk. The new assumption being that as you move toward this cattle-style mindset, you're going to see failure of underlying services, and you have to architect appropriately. The more and more you move toward the cloud, the more and more you have to assume individual pieces of hardware, individual servers will fail. And the question is, how can you build so that the service quality stays high all the way through? With the cloud-native architecture, we see a lot of companies starting to cope using distributed systems, using microservices, so that you've got independently deployable units. If one of them disappears, it doesn't take down the whole application. There are no more single points of failure. And they move toward, from an infrastructure perspective, approaches like containers so that they can encapsulate applications to provide portability. And finally, it really comes down to increasing the speed at which you can iterate, reducing the risk through a careful look at batch sizes. And we take Agile software and continuous delivery as one side of that, of cutting a batch size horizontally through the delivery pipeline. And secondly, if you look at microservices, it's really about how do you cut the batch sizes vertically from an architecture point of view. And each of those helps you lower the risks so that you can continue to move quickly. And with that, I'd like to thank you for your time listening to my portion of the presentation and pass it off to Michael for his view.
Well, great. Thanks for going over that. And we'll list these slides, if you haven't seen already, along with other references in the resource list there that you can look up if you're interested in digging down deeper there. So I just wanted to end up before I actually came up with a few questions to ask Donnie as he was going through that stuff, which I think would be interesting. I wanted to just cover the way that Pivotal approaches all of the exciting opportunity and little twisty-turvy mazes in a lot of the stuff Donnie was going over there. we're essentially a company founded around the idea of improving the way that software is done and helping our customers, primarily large organizations, do better with software. And so a lot of it is based on figuring out what those optimal ways of operating are that Donnie was going over and packaging them up to give to our customers and doing the ongoing maintenance for it. So first, to visualize what that looks like, this is kind of a simplistic diagram of the core offering that we have in this area, Pivotal Cloud Foundry. And it covers a lot of things, but it gives you a sense of how we look at packaging up and providing a platform that enables a better way of doing software. And I think as we go through this stack, you'll realize that a lot of the survey data and other trends and practices that Donnie was going over, it's interesting to look at them and reflect on how those kind of feed into a concept that we at Pivotal and other people call cloud native, if you will. And Donnie was talking a little bit about that as well. And essentially, when you hear that phrase, the way that, at least when I use it, I intend it to be made, and a lot of people at Pivotal, is it's this way of saying when we use these new notions of technologies and process and architecture, that is things like relying on containers and using microservices, and also looking at DevOps to enable this kind of rapid iteration, like the continuous delivery cycle that Donnie was going over. It's just a label to give to all of that. And all of it ultimately is enabled by just cloud technologies and ways of thinking. And so if you look at the 4 layers that we have in Pivotal Cloud Foundry, they essentially support the efforts that companies have not only to write the custom-written software they have that helps run their business, but also run it. So it's also a production runtime container, no pun intended, but environment that's used to host these applications. And in a little bit, I'll go over some of the customers that are using it in production now and the success that they've had. But essentially the way it works is, if you remember or are familiar with the notion of a platform as a service, it's kind of an evolved idea of that. And that's why you'll hear us saying platform. And what we do is we layer on top, starting at the bottom of any type of infrastructure, maybe not any, but all of the popular ones that you might want to use, whether they're infrastructure as a services like AWS or Azure or the Google Cloud, or on-premise infrastructure that you might have like vSphere, and also it works with vAir, both from VMware, and also with OpenStack, if that's something that you want to run your infrastructure on. And we Pivotal Cloud Foundry layers a layer of automation over that, one of those pillars that Donnie had earlier. And essentially what it's doing is removing the need, for the most part, for you to worry about provisioning servers, configuring them, checking on their health checks, and overall making sure your infrastructure is up and running and your workloads are being placed appropriately. And as we go up the stack, you'll get to a lot of what people think of as Pivotal Cloud Foundry. All of this is Pivotal Cloud Foundry, essentially, but it's kind of logically, to use that old phrase, at this layer that it looks more like Pivotal Cloud Foundry. We have the runtime layer that does all of the coordination of your services, or as we used to call it, middleware, and it makes sure that you have your security and your access control, all of the supporting things that you would expect a platform to give you for your applications, all kind of like that sort of enterprise-grade label, if you will. And then above that, above that coordination and that operations for all of your applications and your runtime, we have numerous programming languages, most of them listed over there that we support, and several frameworks that are baked in to Pivotal Cloud Foundry. One of the cases that Donnie was referencing was the way, if you remember one of the more complicated diagrams, all of the microservices that Netflix has. And so they open sourced a large part of how they manage their microservices approaches. And we've been working with them in that code to basically pull in a lot of what the Netflix stack is into Spring Cloud and other aspects of Spring, and have that directly wired into Pivotal Cloud Foundry. So when you get this platform, you get a way of doing microservices and managing it that's fully enabled in this. You don't have to spend a lot of time wiring it together on your own. So finally, just to kind of round it out before we go to another way of looking at what this platform is and how I would suggest you start thinking about how you solve for the idea of improving the software lifecycle with all these things we've been going over. There's also a fair amount of cultural change, as Donnie was referencing, that you can kind of see illustrated a tad there on the left side. And this is actually what we spend a lot of time at Pivotal doing with both our Pivotal Labs practice, who comes in and helps you figure out doing product management and programming in this cloud native style, but also with our various transformation teams and services that help you figure out how to change your organization around to really fit into that mindset and way of operating where you're deploying weekly, if not daily. And if you think about it, think about how your organization operates now and the kind of inputs you have and how your software is defined, written, and operated. And if you move the dial down to deploying daily, think about how different that would be if you wanted to fully take advantage of that, of this idea that you could be deploying code every day, study how it's used, and the next day come up with, albeit small, but a way to improve the software and make it run better. That typically requires a fair amount of change. It's not just sort of like installing some new software and you're off to the races. There's a lot more, as I like to call it, meatware changes that need to happen. So with that larger view of the stack, I want to give another view that you'll hear us talking about that kind of pulls things together in more of a process-oriented way. So if you remember those 4 layers that we had earlier, what we try to think about, what we're the sort of solution we're providing for our customers, is a lot of things on top of this value line that we have, right? So our perspective is and what our customers kind of find is that managing operating systems and managing your IaaS, like that's not the most valuable thing you can do with your IT and with your software. It's certainly necessary to have those things running, but it's not something that is really ultimately what you ship, right? I often joke that, once you get your cloud set up, you have a blinking cursor, and now the real work of writing your software and running it begins. And so our idea is that what you as a user of a cloud platform, a cloud native company, if you will, should focus on are things above that value line. And this is just one example, as I was talking about earlier. So you want to have things that remove, for the most part, the need for you to focus on infrastructure and worry about that, as something like Pivotal Cloud Foundry does, and instead provide you lots of frameworks to work on microservices. And as with most large organizations that we work with, data is a huge concern that you have, right? So you want to take care of all of the different flows of data, your sort of ETL and integration things. And that's another thing, again, taking this tact of, we want to remove as many of the infrastructure-y and service middleware kind of concerns for you and let you focus on your actual application or business logic. We have a lot of those things baked into the platform as well. Now, you're not constrained to using those services, many of them in Spring at all. You can bring your own services, and there's even partners that we work with, both from the sort of community angle from the open source world and also commercial vendors who come in and integrate their services and middleware into the platform as well. Or, as people do, you can write your own services that are enabled and wired in and plugged into this platform. And then we also have, there's a lot of metrics, because remember, this is all about not only write the development and the labs portion of doing your application, but also running it in production. So whenever you're doing that, we have a tremendous amount of instrumented sort of things, metrics that you can get, and all sorts of partners who also come in and give you a more in-depth view of how your applications are running in production to help you manage your new cloud-native style of applications. And then just to illustrate how a lot of what Donnie was talking about plugs into here, we have a continuous integration and delivery workflow thing that it's not quite released now, but it's available as something to start using if you're slightly adventurous, called Concourse, that you can plug into this. Now, of course, you can use the standard sorts of things, whether it's from Atlassian or Jenkins or whatever sort of continuous integration and delivery models you have. But the platform is built to operate as sort of the destination site for a continuous integration and continuous delivery mindset. There's very friendly APIs and common best practices for how you integrate with that flow that you might have. So it's, again, that kind of cloud native aspect. Part of being cloud native is having a continuous delivery pipeline, if you will. So as you would expect, Pivotal Cloud Foundry operates very well with whatever those various pipelines are that you might plug into it. And then also, as I mentioned, there's another part of Pivotal called Pivotal Labs. It's actually where we get our name from. And they are experts in doing that kind of cloud-native sort of application development and product management. And they often get called in with people who want to use Pivotal Cloud Foundry to literally pair with them. So they do pair programming and pair designing and pair product management to coach you up and train you about this new way of doing development, not only from a sort of fingers on keyboard development sort of way, but as I mentioned, doing the design, figuring out what users want and what's best for them, and analyzing how your software is working and not working. And also from a product management or owner, as they say, perspective, so you can think about how you manage that product in the organization that you have. And this is in addition to the transformation services that we have and other consultative services that come in and really change your organization around, not only at the stack level with something like Pivotal Cloud Foundry, but again at the meatware level to change how your organization functions, for the better, of course. So just to wrap up, I wanted to go over quickly some representative customers that we have and sort of zingers from them, if you will. And then I'll go into what I think is one of the more interesting and nice-looking cases after this as well. But you can see that many of the organizations we work with, I don't have a government profile here, but there's several large government agencies that we work with, both here in the U.S. and abroad as well, Australia and Korea. Those are the sort of named ones, if you will. There's others, of course. But you can see that one of the major goals that people come to this platform for is accelerating their development speed, right? And I would say that a slowness in getting your features out the door, a slowness in delivery is a symptom of a core disease that a lot of people have in the IT department. And so tracking the curing of that symptom is incredibly important. And it's the kind of thing that you see early on that's showing that you're healthing up the way that you're doing IT. And so it's a thing that we latch on to quite a bit. And you can see that across these usually very traditional large organizations, by taking that full approach of focusing on things above that value line, right, focusing on the applications that they have, getting a new technology stack in place and doing those meatware fixes, that they're finding that they can really speed up the way that they're doing development. And as you dig deeper into this and you look at each of these cases, you find that the next challenge that they have that I've alluded to many times is changing the expectations of the business side and changing the way that they think about and run their application so that they can start to not only improve their software, but also start to improve their businesses that are fully enabled by their software. And there's a phrase I like to use called a software-enabled business, kind of just a joke on industry terms. But it really gets to that point where software becomes one of those core malleable or agile things that helps the business thrive and grow instead of being a blocker, if you will. And again, evidences of speed and getting software out quickly is one of the first signs that you start seeing of the cure working, if you will. So as an in-depth example of that, this is based on a presentation that Humana did actually last year at the Cloud Foundry Summit. The Pivotal Cloud Foundry is based on an open source platform called Cloud Foundry, and there's various distros of it, including Pivotal Cloud Foundry. And so Humana was using the overall approach that Pivotal has. And their idea was that as a health insurance provider, they want to have a more intimate relationship, that is a more frequent relationship with the people they're insuring. And if they can encourage those people to have more healthy activities, as you can imagine, I mean, it's easy to make this sound cynical, but as a business, it makes them more profitable because there's less payouts to have, right? So the more healthy the people you're insuring are, the less frequently you'll have to pay things out from an actuarial standpoint. So any way that you can get your customers to do things more healthy is definitely a plus. So they took this overall cloud-native approach that we work on here at Pivotal and help our customers with. And the first round of applications they had is one of these applications that if you work at a large company, you've probably encountered these before. And it's a way of basically encouraging and tracking you to do healthy activities. And it had taken them a long time to just get servers provisioned and get code out the door. So they weren't really satisfied with the performance of this application. If I remember, there was basically about like 2 or 3% engagement. So only 2 or 3% of the people who potentially could use it were using it, which is not much of a payoff for an application like that. And by just over the course of less than 3 months, as you can see, they were able to take on this cloud-native mindset and put out a mobile version of the application, study how people use it, and start improving it. And if I remember, they tripled the engagement that they had, or they tripled what their expectations were, and they were getting more and more people using it. Again, directly affecting, as they say, the bottom line, the profit of the company, by making people behave more healthy. And, you know, as an individual, being more healthy is always nice. So there's definitely personal ROI that you have as well. And once they were comfortable with this, with their organizational ability to be more cloud native through working with Pivotal, they set themselves the audacious goal of when the Apple Watch was released, they wanted to release an app on that as well. And they were able to accomplish that on the release day of the Apple Watch in just 5 weeks, which for them, and I'm sure many large organizations out there, maybe not you individually, is quite a feat to go from idea to actual running software in just a little bit over a month is usually something of a marvel for them. And they had another talk at this year's Cloud Foundry Summit where they're kind of giving an update about their progress here. But these kind of results and this kind of ability, these capabilities that we see commonly amongst our customers. And it's something that if you like the notions that Donnie was going over and the end result, that is being able to get software not only out the door faster, but also being able to improve your software by taking advantage of the technologies we've been going over here. And then therefore, by improving your software, improving how your business is operating, it's definitely worth looking into what Pivotal has to offer here. And so before I give some references for further reading, just to further show that it actually is possible and people are finding success with this cloud native approach, here's just a sampling of the various types of organizations that work with us. And many of these organizations are people that you might look at and think like, oh, these are large organizations who are slow moving, and I frankly maybe don't expect a tremendous amount from them if they're using traditional ways of doing IT. But in fact, when you go talk with these companies, you find that just like anyone who's working in IT, they really want to strive and do a fantastic job of what they're doing. And they found that the tools that they were using, the sort of legacy tool set, were slowing them down and not allowing them to move as quickly as they wanted to and improve the software. But through keeping up with a lot of the different technologies and processes that Donnie was going over, and also with working with Pivotal, both with the labs, the consultative approach that we have, and also with Pivotal Cloud Foundry, all of these organizations have found that they're breaking through that logjam that they had. And they're actually moving at kind of a speed that we would expect from the sort of unicorn set, if you will, as it's fun to joke about. And it's really encouraging to work with and talk with a lot of these companies and find that they're kind of transforming from sort of Eeyores about IT, like they're just sort of a little down about what their abilities are. But when they go through this program, if you will, and start using the new tools and start thinking about how to use custom-written software in a new way, they all get kind of cheery and they start getting much more results, and it's really great to see that happening. So just to wrap up, before I ask those questions that were sort of in my mind as Donnie was talking, I wanted to go over 3 things if you want to dig deeper. The first one, and we'll put this in this is in the resource list, as you can see, and these are also pretty easy to look up if you want to bust out of the resource list there. But the first one is a little booklet. I think, if I remember, it's about 50 or 60 pages. And it's as in-depth as an overview as you would want to have in that many pages, going over not only what the cloud-native mindset is, but also what it looks like to think about and do microservices and take that approach. And it also addresses one of the commonly asked things: what do I do with my existing legacy application and services? How do I fit those in there? The second one in the middle is a wonderful overview of Cloud Foundry itself. And it's not a very technical book, surprisingly, given the title of it and the sort of like futuristic weird photo on the cover there. But it actually explains the problems Cloud Foundry solves, the different components of it, and why it chooses to solve it in the way it does. So if you're thinking about how would we define the strategy or the stack to take advantage of this cloud native stuff, it's a good overview of that. And finally, the last one, the Cloud Native Journey, is a booklet that I put out last year that goes over 3 stages of thinking through how you can start doing things in a cloud native way. It goes over dealing with brand new applications, dealing with legacy applications, and transforming the entire organization. And it's a brief 30 or 40 pages or so, and it kind of summarizes a lot of the cultural changes and things like that we were discussing. So with that, I think we have time for just a little bit of discussion with Donnie. So let me, as he takes a sip of coffee and comes off mute there, let me look up the questions here. You ready, Donnie?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure you got a webcam on me somewhere, because that's exactly what I was doing.
That's right. I'm just bemoaning the fact that I quickly drank through my own cup of coffee here, so I can't get a little jolt of it. So to something that I was even referencing on this slide, I'm curious to hear definitely with all of the surveying that you guys do and people that you go talk with, something that comes up all the time when I talk with people is like, yeah, that all sounds wonderful, except I have like all these legacy things I have to deal with. And it's certainly, I don't know, almost a mental hurdle and operational hurdle, I guess, that people have. But I'm curious, like how you're seeing people dealing with legacy, whether it's application or services or processes that they have. Like how do they get through that log jam or even kind of frame it up?
Yeah, I think there's a couple of different perspectives on that. One of them is, there's a really great set of books by a guy named John Cotter on change management, which helps with the transformation aspects of this and thinking through, there's a lot of common patterns here, whether it's technological or otherwise, of how do you make a major change happen in a company. And I think to bring it back to this side of things, just like anything else, you got to start with building some buy-in and generating small wins. You can't start by saying, hey, we're going to flip the switch. We're going to ship nothing to our customers for the next 18 months while we do this cloud-native transition. You've got to go one piece at a time, generate small wins, and gradually get from here to there instead of some Phoenix project, if you will.
Right.
And then,
yeah,
how does that work in action? I mean, there's a lot of different questions on how do you do that? A lot of times we see people starting more with greenfield projects, although, I think what's interesting is increasingly we see a lot of ops teams who want to centralize on single platforms instead of adding yet another tool to support. And so in many cases, and I showed you a little bit of data on this at the beginning, in many cases, they'll forklift over, let's say, cloud foreign applications just so they can get them into the same platform, and maybe they'll put more robust hardware under that particular instantiation of the platform.
Yeah, I mean that reflects a lot of what I tend to see and the advice that I give, which it's a little counterintuitive maybe, but it's essentially I don't know. There's two main things that I think most people don't think about, and one of them is start small. like when doing something new, like every journey begins with a single step or whatever trite saying you want to use, but it's good to start small and I don't know if exponentially, but at some point you do have to start growing bigger and bigger. But as you say, until you get those initial wins and you figured it out, kind of like with the Humana case, like it's probably not advisable to just like plan to rewrite everything over the next year. Like there's a lot of things that you won't be anticipating that you'll want to figure out and see how your particular organization fits with it. And then, I mean, the other thing that's worth calling out, at least in my mind, is it's good to learn how to start doing a little bit of internal marketing, because a lot of what you'll end up doing is selling people on doing this new way. And that's sometimes an odious thing for people who would rather like talk to a computer than talk to people to do. But I find that a lot of people who've had long-term success with transforming anything, let alone to a cloud-native approach, much of it is they learn to be pretty good at rhetoric and persuasion, or just marketing, if you will, and winning people over. So then,
I mean, from a technical perspective, you might call it evangelism, right? Just think about giving internal talks to your own company about how interesting this technology is and how they should move over to it. And then as you move higher and higher and try and generate buy-in at different levels, it becomes more of a business-centric conversation.
Yeah. It's sort of like starts with the brown bag, ends with a summit. You got to go beyond just little lunch and learns and spread it out there. But that seems to work out. So the other thing, like before we wrap up on that topic, so one of the discussions that's out there a lot is this idea of, I don't know, two-speed or bimodal IT, and that is the way that you deal with legacy and organizational change is you partition off the IT that you have, and you have one set of IT that's focused more on, I guess, like resiliency and stability, and kind of the old way of doing things. It's low risk, and you have another section that's more focused on doing the new way, the higher risk things that might go up and down. And I don't know. I've noticed that everyone has an opinion about if that's a good approach or not. So I'm curious, like, what's your opinion on that framing for things?
Yeah, I mean, I think unsurprisingly, you'll hear from me that that's really an oversimplification of reality. The way I look at things is almost universally, there's always a spectrum, and it's important when you're thinking about this bimodal approach or anything else. What's the transition cost? What's the expected benefits? And taking a rational portfolio view of, hey, we've got this old tooling. Should we end of life it? Should we refactor it? or should we outsource it? And in a lot of cases, what we see is with legacy software, it doesn't provide a big benefit. People don't take a let's move slow approach. Instead, they say, this is not a core differentiator for the business. We're going to move to a software as a service company for it. And so it's much more about business value and outsourcing things that don't provide that, pulling in platforms when that makes sense, and then making sure you're only building the stuff that provides you value as a business on top, and avoiding any effort or money or time on the rest. Because I think I was just at a conference and one of the ops speakers basically said, look, you're going to spend way more time and effort running this thing in production than you ever will developing it. And so the idea that you can just keep the mainframe that's been around forever, that's going to be really expensive. And you got to consider the long-term costs when you're thinking about rewrites and about refactors and about moving everything toward a more agile approach and outsourcing the stuff that doesn't make sense to keep in-house.
Yeah, no, it's funny you mentioned that. That reminds me of one of the little jokes I do in that Cloud Native Journey book in the legacy part where at some point it's sort of like, so dealing with this legacy stuff is a hassle, which you should use as forward-moving motivation to always do good portfolio management and not sort of just let things fall behind. Because it's maybe someone previous people in your role were responsible for this, but if you don't kind of stay on top of managing your portfolio, then you start to get stuck in the mire, which is tedious and annoying. Yeah,
exactly. And one more thing, I think we've been talking through, at least through my part of the talk, is how do you I think it's really important to say, look, it's not a balance between agility and risk. You can get both at the same time. So this idea that it's move fast on one end and stable on the other end is a false dichotomy. You can move fast and stay stable, and that's what all these modern approaches to software architecture and delivery are about.
Indeed. Yeah, that was one of the, in the more recent coverage of the DevOps reports that come out every year. There was some interesting findings and sort of like theoretic fancy math around all of that you can have resilience and speed, which is very encouraging. So, well, with that, first of all, thanks, Donnie, for going over this with us. I appreciate it, and I'm sure the audience thought it was good stuff. And also, thanks to the audience for listening along here. As you can see in the resource list, there's all sorts of things you can look up, including these 3 books and the slides that we have and other items. And if you're interested in reaching out and talking out more, I'm pretty easy to find. I'm just Coté, C-O-T-E, at pivotal.io, or you can talk to me on Twitter as well, where I'm just Coté. So I have the, cloud native ways of communicating there, if you will. And I'm always happy to hear how questions people have and how they're going through this. And we'll see everyone next time. Bye-bye.